The afternoon sun slanted across the grocery store parking lot, turning the pavement into a mirror of heat that shimmered and distorted everything beyond 20 feet. I held Lucy's hand tighter as we walked toward our car, her small fingers sticky from the juice box she had finished in the store, her voice a bright stream of chatter about the cookies I had promised for dessert. My mind was already running through the evening's schedule, the tight choreography of dinner and bath and bedtime that governed our lives, when the sound cut through everything. A woman's voice, sharp with panic, the word no stretched thin and desperate. My head snapped toward the sound. Near a black sedan idling at the curb, two men flanked a young woman, their hands gripping her arms, their bodies angled to force her toward the open car door. She twisted against them, her dark hair whipping across her face, and the terror in her eyes was so raw it stopped my breath. Every instinct screamed at me to look away, to pull Lucy closer and keep walking, to protect my daughter from whatever violence was unfolding 30 feet away. But I knew that look. I had worn it once, years ago, when Lucy's father had backed me into a corner, and I had believed there was no way out. My hand trembled as I pulled my phone from my pocket. I did not think. I just moved. I walked toward them, my voice louder than I knew it could be, ringing across the parking lot. "Hey, stop! Let her go!" The men turned, their faces hard and cold, assessing me like I was an insect to be crushed. One of them told me to mind my business, his tone flat and final. But people were looking now, an older man pausing with his shopping cart, a woman standing by her car with keys in hand. I held up my phone, my thumb hovering over the screen. "I am calling the police right now unless you let her go." My heart slammed against my ribs so hard I thought they might hear it, thought they might see how afraid I was, but I kept my eyes on them and my voice steady. The taller man swore, his grip loosening, and the young woman wrenched herself free, stumbling toward me. The men exchanged a look, something passing between them I could not read. And then they were sliding into the car, the engine growling as they pulled away fast enough to leave rubber on the pavement. The young woman stood beside me, shaking so violently I reached out to steady her. "Are you hurt? Do you need a hospital?" She shook her head, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "No, no hospital. Please." Her clothes were expensive, I noticed, a silk blouse and tailored pants that probably cost more than my rent, and the watch on her wrist caught the light, delicate, and clearly worth a fortune. Lucy pressed against my leg, her earlier chatter silenced by confusion. I crouched down. "Baby, can you be brave for a minute while I help this lady?" Lucy nodded, her eyes wide, and I turned back to the young woman. "There is a cafe across the street. Let me buy you some water." She hesitated, glancing back at where the car had been, and then nodded. Inside the small cafe, I settled Lucy with a muffin and crayons the waitress provided, while the young woman sat across from me, her hands wrapped around a glass of water she did not drink. "I am Eleanor. What is your name?" She met my eyes, and for a moment I thought she might not answer. "Sophia." Just Sophia. I did not push. I recognized the desire to keep pieces of yourself hidden when everything felt like it was crumbling. "Do you want to tell me what that was about?" She shook her head, her jaw tightening. "I cannot. I am sorry. I understand you helped me, and I cannot even explain why." "It is complicated." I believed her. Complicated was a word I understood intimately. I pulled out my phone and opened a new contact. "Here, take my number. If you need help, or if you just need to talk to someone, call me." She looked at the phone, then at me, something shifting in her expression. "Why are you doing this?" "Because someone should have done it for me once." She entered the number, her fingers still trembling, and then stood. "Thank you, Eleanor. I mean it." She left before I could say anything else, disappearing into the street. And I sat there with Lucy coloring beside me, my own hands finally starting to shake now that the adrenaline was fading. That night, after Lucy was asleep, I stood at my kitchen window looking out at the quiet street below, but all I could see was the terror in Sophia's eyes, a mirror of my own past, and I wondered what kind of danger I had just stepped into. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. 3 days passed in the familiar rhythm of survival, my shifts at the hospital blurring together in a haze of vital signs and medication schedules, and the particular exhaustion that came from holding other people's pain all day. I had almost convinced myself that the incident in the parking lot was over, that Sophia was safe wherever she had gone, that I could file the memory away with all the other moments of crisis I had witnessed and move on. Then I came home on Thursday evening, Lucy's hand in mine as we climbed the steps to our building, and saw the car. It sat at the curb like a predator at rest, black and sleek, and so obviously expensive that it did not belong on our street, where the other vehicles were rusted sedans and dented hatchbacks held together by prayer and duct tape. My steps slowed. Lucy tugged at my hand, asking why we were stopping, and I told her to wait, my voice coming out steadier than I felt. The driver's door opened, and a man emerged, tall and lean in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than I made in a month, his face all hard angles and watchful eyes that assessed me with the clinical precision of someone trained to identify threats. He approached with measured steps, his hands visible and empty, but everything about his posture communicated controlled danger. "Miss Thornhill." His voice was smooth, polite, utterly at odds with the tension coiling in my stomach. "My name is James Montague. Someone would like to speak with you, to thank you for your assistance earlier this week." I tightened my grip on Lucy's hand. "I do not know what you are talking about." His expression did not change, but something flickered in his eyes. Acknowledgement, perhaps, that we both knew I was lying. "It will only take 30 minutes of your time. I can wait while you make arrangements for your daughter." This was not a request. The politeness was a veneer over something immovable, and I understood with cold clarity that refusing might have consequences I could not afford. Lucy was pressed against my leg, sensing my fear, and I forced myself to think past the panic. Catherine was home. I had seen her car in the lot. I could leave Lucy with her. But every instinct screamed that going anywhere with this man was dangerous. "I cannot just leave with a stranger." James inclined his head slightly. "I understand your concern. You may text a friend with updates during the drive. Your daughter will be perfectly safe. I assure you, no harm will come to either of you." The underlying message was clear. Cooperate and we stay safe. Refuse and all bets are off. I swallowed hard. 30 minutes. He nodded. 30 minutes. I took Lucy upstairs to Catherine's apartment, my neighbor opening the door with her usual warm smile that faded when she saw my face. "Emergency at work," I lied, hating how easily the falsehood came. "Can you watch Lucy for an hour?" Catherine agreed immediately, ushering Lucy inside, and I kissed my daughter's forehead, breathing in her shampoo scent like it might be the last time. Then I was walking back down to the street, sliding into the back seat of the car that smelled of leather and subtle cologne, my phone clutched in my hand as James closed the door with a solid click that sounded too much like a cell locking. He drove in silence through streets that grew progressively cleaner, the buildings shifting from tired brick to stately stone, the trees larger and greener, wealth accumulating around us like a rising tide. I texted Catherine twice, my fingers shaking, reporting intersections and directions, though I had no idea if it would matter if something went wrong. James offered no conversation, and I did not ask questions, too afraid of what the answers might be. After 25 minutes, we turned onto a private road, massive iron gates swinging open at our approach, and my breath caught at the estate sprawling before us. It was not just a house, it was a statement of power, all columned facade and manicured grounds, the kind of place that appeared in magazines about people who shaped the world from behind closed doors. James parked near the entrance and came around to open my door, gesturing toward the marble steps. My legs felt unsteady as I climbed them. Inside, the foyer was all soaring ceilings and crystalline chandeliers, opulence that made my modest apartment feel like a cardboard box. James led me down a hallway lined with art that was probably worth more than I would earn in my lifetime, stopping before a heavy wooden door. He knocked once, a courtesy that felt performative, and then opened it. The study beyond was dimly lit, the late afternoon sun filtering through heavy curtains, and behind a massive desk sat a figure I could barely make out, his face in shadow. My heart hammered against my ribs. The man stood, rising with a fluid grace that spoke of absolute confidence, and stepped into the light. My breath caught and held. He was younger than I expected, perhaps mid-30s, with dark hair cut precisely, and eyes that were nearly black in the lamplight, watchful and intelligent, and entirely focused on me, in a way that made my skin prickle with awareness. He wore a dark suit tailored to fit his frame, like it had been made for him, which it probably had, and when he moved around the desk toward me, his steps were silent and controlled, a man completely certain of his place in the world. "Miss Thornhill," he said, his voice low and smooth with an edge of authority that made it clear he was accustomed to being obeyed. "I am Alexander Sinclair. I wanted to thank you personally for what you did for my sister." The name hit me like cold water, recognition flooding through me because I had heard it before, whispered in news reports about organized crime and territorial disputes, speculation about the man who controlled half the city's underground economy from behind a facade of legitimate business. My throat went dry and I must have gone pale because something shifted in his expression, a slight narrowing of his eyes as if he was cataloging my reaction. "Please, sit," he said, gesturing to the leather chair positioned across from his desk, and though it was phrased as an invitation, the expectation of compliance was clear. I sat because my legs felt unsteady, my hands folded tightly in my lap to keep them from shaking. Alexander returned to his own chair, leaning back with an ease that somehow made him more intimidating rather than less. "Sophia told me what you did. You put yourself at risk to help a stranger, drew attention to prevent her from being taken. Not many people would have done that." I found my voice, though it came out thinner than I wanted. "Is she all right?" He nodded, and I saw tension flicker in his jaw, a muscle jumping beneath the smooth surface. "She is safe now. She had left the estate without informing me, against my explicit instructions, and was targeted by individuals who wished to use her as leverage. Because of you, they failed." His eyes held mine, and I could not look away, caught in the intensity of his regard. "I owe you a debt, Miss Thornhill. Tell me what you want, and if it is within my power, it is yours." The offer hung in the air between us, and I knew this was a test, that whatever I asked for would tell him something about who I was. I wanted to refuse anything from a man like him, a criminal no matter how courteous his manner, but I also knew that insulting him might be dangerous. I cleared my throat. "I do not want anything. I just want to be left alone to raise my daughter in peace." Something flickered across his face. Surprise, perhaps, or something close to it, and he leaned forward slightly. "That is all? No money, no favors, no requests, just to be left alone?" I nodded, holding his gaze even though everything in me wanted to look away. "That is all." Alexander studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and I had the unsettling sense that he was seeing past the surface to everything I tried to keep hidden, all my fears and desperation and determination. "Very well," he said finally. "You have my gratitude, and you will not be bothered again. However, I insist on providing security for you and your daughter until I am certain the threat has been fully addressed. My rivals may have seen you intervene." "No," I said quickly, too quickly, fear making my voice sharp. "No security. I do not want your people watching me. We will be fine." His eyebrows rose slightly, and I realized I had just refused him, something that probably did not happen often. "Miss Thornhill, I cannot in good conscience leave you unprotected when you may have drawn dangerous attention. I appreciate your independence, but this is not negotiable. Anger cut through my fear, hot and sudden. Everything is negotiable, Mr. Sinclair. I helped your sister because it was the right thing to do, not because I wanted to be pulled into your world. My daughter and I will manage on our own like we always have. We sat in silence, the air thick with tension, and then unexpectedly, Alexander smiled, a small curve of his mouth that transformed his face from intimidating to something far more dangerous. As you wish. But take this. He pulled a card from his desk drawer and slid it across the polished surface. My private number. If you need anything, if you feel unsafe, call me immediately, day or night. I took the card because refusing seemed pointless, the heavy paper expensive between my fingers, and then James was at the door as if summoned by some invisible signal, ready to drive me home. Alexander stood as I rose, his eyes never leaving mine. It was a pleasure to meet you, Eleanor. I hope we will speak again. The way he said my name, familiar and deliberate, sent a shiver down my spine that I could not quite identify as fear. I told myself I could return to normal, that I could pretend the meeting with Alexander Sinclair had been an aberration in my otherwise predictable life, a single strange encounter that would fade into memory like so many other things I had survived. I went back to my shifts at the hospital, measuring medications and checking charts, and holding the hands of frightened patients. Lucy attended her kindergarten class with her lunchbox and bright purple backpack, and for 2 days everything felt almost ordinary. Then on Saturday afternoon, as I walked Lucy home from the park, I saw it. The black SUV parked half a block from our building, windows tinted dark, engine running. My steps faltered, and Lucy asked what was wrong, tugging my hand, and I forced myself to keep walking, even as my heart began to pound against my ribs. I told myself it was coincidence that not every expensive vehicle meant danger, but when I glanced back from our apartment window 20 minutes later, the SUV was still there, a patient predator keeping watch. Sunday it appeared again, different location but same unmistakable presence, and by Monday morning when I left for my early shift and saw it parked across the street, anger began to burn through my fear. He had agreed to leave me alone. He had said I would not be bothered. This was a violation of the one thing I had asked for, and the fury rising in my chest was hot and clarifying. I pulled out my phone and found the card he had given me, the heavy paper still in my wallet, where I had shoved it trying to forget it existed, and I dialed the number with shaking fingers. He answered on the second ring, his voice smooth and unsurprised as if he had been expecting my call. Eleanor. The familiarity in his tone made my anger spike higher. You said you would leave me alone, I said, not bothering with greetings or pleasantries. There is an SUV watching my apartment. I want it gone. Now. A pause, and I could almost see him leaning back in whatever expensive chair he occupied, considering his response. The security is temporary, he said finally, until I am certain the individuals who targeted Sophia have been properly dealt with. You may have been seen helping her. I cannot risk your safety. I do not want your protection, I snapped, aware that I was standing on the sidewalk outside the hospital, hissing into my phone like I had lost my mind. We had an agreement. You do not get to decide what is best for me. Another pause, longer this time, and when he spoke again, there was something different in his voice, a thread of what might have been amusement or perhaps surprise. You are quite insistent on your independence. It is an admirable quality, but in this case a dangerous one. The threat is real, Eleanor. I will not apologize for ensuring you remain safe. Then I will call the police and report that I am being stalked, I said, the words reckless and desperate. Silence stretched between us, taut as a wire, and I wondered if I had just made a terrible mistake. Very well, he said finally, and now there was definitely amusement in his tone. I will pull back the surveillance on one condition: have dinner with me. Saturday evening, so I can thank you properly without armed guards hovering nearby, making you uncomfortable. I opened my mouth to refuse, to tell him I wanted nothing from him, including dinner. But some part of me hesitated. This was manipulation, I knew that. A man accustomed to getting what he wanted by whatever means necessary. But another part of me, a part I did not want to examine too closely, wondered what it would be like to sit across from him without fear clouding everything, to understand the man behind the reputation. Fine, I said before I could reconsider. One dinner, then you leave me alone. Agreed, he said, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. I will send details. The call ended and I stood staring at my phone, wondering what I had just agreed to and why my pulse was racing with something that felt disturbingly like anticipation. That evening, Catherine came over with wine and concern written across her face, settling onto my secondhand couch while Lucy played in her room. You are playing with fire, she said without preamble, and I did not bother asking how she knew because Catherine always knew everything. He is dangerous, Eleanor. Men like that do not have dinner with women like us without wanting something. I know, I said, sinking into the chair across from her and accepting the wine glass she offered. But he will not stop watching me unless I agree, and I need him to stop. Catherine studied me with eyes that saw too much. Is that the only reason? I looked away, heat rising in my cheeks. Yes. She made a sound that conveyed utter disbelief but did not push, and we sat in silence drinking cheap wine while I tried to convince myself that my racing heart, when I thought of Alexander Sinclair's dark eyes, was only fear and nothing more complicated or dangerous than that. Saturday arrived with the weight of inevitability, and I found myself standing in front of my closet, feeling like a foolish teenager preparing for prom, instead of a 28-year-old woman who should know better than to have dinner with a man whose world was built on violence and control. I pulled out dresses and discarded them, everything either too casual or trying too hard, until finally I settled on a simple black dress that fell just below my knees, elegant without being provocative, paired with the one good pair of heels I owned that did not make me feel like I was playing dress-up. Catherine had taken Lucy for a sleepover despite her continued reservations, extracting a promise that I would text her every hour and call if anything felt wrong, and now my apartment was too quiet as I waited, my nerves stretched thin as wire. When the knock came at exactly 7 p.m., I jumped despite expecting it, and when I opened the door, Alexander stood there alone. No James or entourage or visible security, dressed in dark slacks and a charcoal shirt that made his eyes look even darker. And the sight of him stole my breath in a way I absolutely did not want to acknowledge. You look beautiful, he said, his voice low and sincere, and heat rose in my cheeks as I murmured something about him looking nice too, the words inadequate and awkward. The car he led me to was sleek and expensive, but he opened the door himself, no driver waiting, and as he pulled into traffic I realized we were truly alone for the first time since that night in his study. The restaurant was in a part of the city I rarely visited, all old money and established wealth, the kind of place where reservations were made months in advance. But when we arrived, the maitre d' greeted Alexander by name and led us to a private corner where I realized with a start that we were the only patrons present. The entire restaurant closed for the evening. This is too much, I said, as Alexander held my chair, unease prickling along my spine. I thought this was just dinner. I wanted you to feel comfortable, he replied, settling across from me. You were nervous about being seen with me. This way you can speak freely without worrying about who might be watching. The consideration in the gesture caught me off guard, a thoughtfulness I had not expected from a man with his reputation. And as wine was poured and courses began to arrive, our conversation started cautiously, but gradually found rhythm. He asked about Lucy, and I was protective at first, but found myself sharing how I was raising her alone after her father had left when she was 6 months old, how he had wanted no part of fatherhood despite his promises. And I watched Alexander's expression darken with something that looked like genuine anger on my behalf. A man who abandons his child is no man at all, he said quietly, and there was such conviction in his voice that I believed he meant it. I asked about Sophia, and he shared carefully edited details about raising her after their parents died, in what he described only as an accident when he was 23 and she was 10, how he had built everything he had to give her safety and security, and I saw past the dangerous exterior to something unexpected, a man who had sacrificed his own innocence to protect someone he loved. The attraction between us had been simmering since that first meeting, but now it built with every exchanged glance, every moment our eyes held across the table, and when he drove me home, his hand brushed mine as he helped me from the car, and electricity shot through me so intense I gasped. He walked me to my door, and we stood in the dim hallway, the air thick with everything unspoken, and I fled inside before I could do something reckless, my heart pounding as I leaned against the closed door and wondered what I was falling into. I told myself I could forget about Alexander Sinclair, that I could return to the ordinary rhythm of my life and pretend that dinner had been nothing more than a polite conclusion to an uncomfortable situation. But I found myself thinking about him at the strangest moments, his voice echoing in my mind when I measured medications, the memory of his hand brushing mine sending heat through me when I should have been focused on patient charts. I threw myself into work with renewed intensity, picking up extra shifts and volunteering for the cases no one else wanted, anything to keep my mind occupied. And at home, I was all focus and attention for Lucy, reading her extra stories and playing endless games of pretend where she was a princess and I was the dragon, though she always insisted the dragon should be nice and just misunderstood. It was Tuesday afternoon during my lunch break when I saw Sophia Sinclair walking through the hospital lobby, her designer coat and confident stride drawing attention even in the utilitarian space, and my heart jumped into my throat as she scanned the room, and her eyes landed on me with clear recognition and purpose. She approached my table in the cafeteria with a warm smile that transformed her face from the terrified girl I had helped into someone radiant and alive, and when she asked if she could sit, I nodded, too surprised to form words. "I wanted to thank you properly," she said, settling across from me with easy grace. "Alexander told me what you did, how you refused any reward, and I have been thinking about you ever since." We talked for 30 minutes, and I found myself genuinely liking her, her intelligence and humor evident once the fear was stripped away, and she told me she had been researching me in a way that should have felt invasive, but somehow came across as flattering, mentioning my work at the hospital and how I was raising Lucy alone, and how impressed she was by my independence and strength. "My brother has not stopped talking about you," she said suddenly, her eyes sparkling with something between mischief and sincerity, and my stomach did a traitorous flip at the words. "He never talks about women, Eleanor, never, but he mentions you constantly, analyzing every word you said at dinner, like he is trying to solve some impossible puzzle." I did not know what to say to that, heat rising in my cheeks as I stared at my coffee, and Sophia reached across the table to touch my hand gently. "His world is dangerous," she said quietly, the playfulness gone from her voice. "I will not lie to you about that, but I think you might be exactly what he needs, someone who sees past all the power and control to the man underneath." Before I left, she hugged me tight and whispered that she hoped to see me again soon, and I found myself hoping the same thing despite every rational voice in my head screaming warnings. That evening I was making dinner, Lucy chattering about her day at kindergarten while I chopped vegetables with distracted precision, when my phone rang with a number I had memorized despite every intention not to, and my hand trembled slightly as I answered. "Eleanor," Alexander said, and there was something in his voice that made my blood run cold, a tension that spoke of danger and fury barely contained. "There has been an incident, and I need you to listen carefully without panicking." My world tilted on its axis and everything around me became distant and muffled as Alexander's words registered. Something about Richard Drummond discovering my involvement with Sophia, something about retaliation and territorial disputes, and me being marked as a target, and the knife I was holding clattered to the cutting board as my knees went weak. Lucy was there in the kitchen singing a made-up song about butterflies and sunshine, oblivious to the way terror was lancing through me like ice water in my veins, and I turned away from her so she would not see my face, as Alexander continued speaking in that carefully controlled voice that told me he was barely containing fury beneath the surface. "You and Lucy need protection immediately," he said, and I could hear an engine in the background like he was already moving. "I am sending James with a security team to your apartment, and I will be there within 30 minutes. And Eleanor, you need to listen to me very carefully and not argue about this, because the threat is real and immediate." I wanted to refuse, wanted to scream that I would not be pulled into his violent world, that Lucy's safety meant staying far away from men like him and their endless cycles of vengeance and blood, but the fear for my daughter overrode every other instinct, and I found myself nodding even though he could not see me, whispering that I understood. I ended the call and stood there shaking, my mind racing through options that all led nowhere good, and Lucy tugged on my shirt asking if I was okay, and I forced a smile that felt like shattered glass on my face and told her everything was fine. James arrived in less than an hour with 2 other men, all of them moving with that controlled efficiency that spoke of military training and violence held in check, and they swept through my modest apartment checking windows and sight lines, while I held Lucy close and tried not to let her see how terrified I was. Alexander arrived 20 minutes later, and the sight of him in my doorway, his expression carved from stone, and his dark eyes burning with barely restrained rage, made something in my chest constrict painfully. He dismissed his men to positions outside and then turned to me, and I saw the moment his control cracked slightly, saw genuine fear beneath the fury as he took in my pale face and trembling hands. "I am sorry," he said quietly, moving closer, but stopping short of touching me like he was afraid I would shatter. "Richard Drummond learned you were the one who intervened with Sophia, and he is using that to provoke me, to prove he can reach anyone I care about. And this is my fault for not anticipating he would discover the connection." I was angry then, anger cutting through the fear like a blade, and I demanded to know why helping his sister had painted a target on my daughter, why Lucy had to pay for his world's violence. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew they were unfair because I had made the choice to intervene, and some part of me even now did not regret it. Alexander took the anger without defending himself, his jaw tight as he explained that Drummond was retaliating for recent territorial disputes and would use anyone connected to Alexander as leverage or punishment, and he promised with such intensity that I believed him that he would end the threat quickly and permanently. That night he insisted on staying personally, refusing to delegate my protection to his men, and he positioned himself in my living room after I put Lucy to bed with a story about how Alexander was a friend who was visiting for a little while. I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling knowing he was just beyond my door, hyper-aware of his presence in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with that dangerous attraction I had been trying to deny. And finally, at 2 a.m., I gave up on sleep and emerged for water. He was awake in the darkened living room, vigilant and alert despite the late hour. And when I entered the kitchen, he followed silently, and we stood there in the dim glow of the streetlight filtering through my window. "I am sorry," he said again, and there was something raw in his voice I had not heard before. "I never meant to bring this to your door, Eleanor. Never wanted my world to touch you or Lucy." I poured water with hands that still shook slightly and turned to face him, this dangerous man who had upended my life twice now, and found myself saying the truth I had not wanted to acknowledge. "I do not regret helping Sophia," I told him quietly. "Not even now, not even with this threat hanging over us, because she needed help, and I could give it, and that is who I am." Alexander stared at me with something like wonder in his dark eyes, and the space between us felt charged with more than just fear, thick with possibility and danger, and something I was not ready to name. The next morning I woke to the sound of Lucy's bedroom door opening and the soft pad of her small feet on the hallway floor, and panic shot through me as I remembered Alexander was in our living room, a dangerous stranger in the space my daughter believed was safe. But before I could intercept her, I heard her voice bright with curiosity, asking who he was. I rushed out of my bedroom still in my pajamas and found Lucy standing in front of Alexander with her favorite stuffed rabbit clutched under one arm, her head tilted in that fearless way children have when they have not yet learned that the world holds threats. And Alexander was crouched down to her level with an expression of such careful gentleness that it stopped my words in my throat. "This is Alexander," I said, moving to Lucy's side and resting my hand on her shoulder. "He is a friend who is helping keep us safe for a little while, like a guardian." Lucy accepted this explanation with the easy trust of a 5-year-old and immediately launched into a detailed account of her stuffed rabbit's name and personality, while Alexander listened with what appeared to be genuine attention, and I stood there stunned by the surreal domesticity of the scene, this man whose world was built on violence and power, kneeling on my worn carpet nodding seriously as my daughter explained that Mr. Flopsy liked carrots, but only the imaginary kind. Over breakfast, Lucy chattered endlessly, asking Alexander questions that ranged from whether he liked pancakes to whether he had ever seen a real elephant. And he answered each one with patience I had not known he possessed, his dangerous edges somehow softened in the morning light streaming through my kitchen window. I watched him cut Lucy's pancakes into smaller pieces without being asked, and felt something in my chest crack open painfully, a longing for something I had convinced myself we did not need. And when his eyes met mine over Lucy's head, I saw my own confusion reflected back. This strange intimacy neither of us had anticipated. The following days fell into a rhythm that felt both natural and impossible. Alexander working from my small dining table with his laptop and phone, while Lucy played nearby, and I moved through my shifts at the hospital in a haze of hyper-awareness, knowing he was there in my space, filling it with his presence. I became acutely conscious of every movement, the way I had to squeeze past him in the narrow hallway, and how his scent of cedar and something darker lingered in rooms after he left them. The domestic intimacy of the situation intensifying the attraction I was trying desperately to control, because letting myself feel this was dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with Richard Drummond. Catherine visited on the third day and took one look at the careful way Alexander and I orbited each other and pulled me into my bedroom with barely concealed alarm, demanding to know what I was doing letting this man into my home and my life. But even as she spoke, I saw the moment her concern shifted to something else, a recognition that made her grip my hands tightly and say she had never seen me so alive, so present, and that terrified her almost as much as the danger did. On the fourth night, I could not bear the tension any longer, the constant awareness of Alexander moving through my apartment, like we were circling each other in a dance neither of us had agreed to learn. And after I put Lucy to bed with her usual story and kissed her forehead, I found him standing at my living room window, staring out at the street below, with his phone in his hand and his shoulders tight with controlled alertness. "How long is this going to continue?" I asked, and my voice came out sharper than I intended, edged with frustration and fear, and something else I did not want to name. Alexander turned to face me, and the shadows from the streetlight carved his features into something stark and dangerous. And he was quiet for a long moment, before admitting that Drummond was proving more elusive than anticipated, that his network was deeper and his resources more extensive than initial intelligence suggested. I felt anger flare hot in my chest, cutting through the exhaustion and constant fear, and I accused him of using the threat as an excuse to stay, of dragging this out because it gave him control over my life and access to my home, and I saw the moment my words hit him like a physical blow. He moved closer, and his carefully maintained control slipped enough that I could see the raw emotion beneath, the hunger and frustration, and something that looked almost like desperation. And he said in a voice rough with honesty that I was exactly right, that he was using every justification he could find to stay, because the thought of being away from me was unbearable, and he knew that made him selfish and dangerous in an entirely different way. I should have been frightened by the admission, should have ordered him out and built every wall I could between us. But instead, I felt exhilarated, like standing at the edge of a cliff, with wind tearing at my clothes, knowing one step would send me flying. I confessed in a whisper that barely carried across the space between us, that I felt the same despite every rational thought screaming that this was madness, that everything about him and his world should send me running, but instead I found myself drawn closer, like gravity had shifted and he had become the center. Alexander reached out slowly, giving me time to retreat, and cupped my face with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. And he asked permission, not with words, but with his dark eyes searching mine with an intensity that stripped away every pretense, and I nodded because I was done fighting what I wanted. He kissed me, and all the pent-up tension of the past days exploded between us in a collision of mouths and hands and desperate need, his kiss claiming and demanding and giving all at once, and I felt myself falling into something I could not control and did not want to. My fingers tangling in his hair as I pulled him closer, and tasted the groan that rumbled through his chest. The world narrowed to sensation and heat, and the feeling of his body solid against mine. And when he finally pulled back, we were both breathing hard and staring at each other like we had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Alexander rested his forehead against mine, and his voice was wrecked when he promised he would not touch me again until I was truly safe and could choose him freely without fear or obligation coloring the decision. And I wanted to argue, but knew he was right, even as my body screamed in protest at the loss of contact, and we stood there in my dimly lit living room, trembling with want and the terrible knowledge that we had just made everything infinitely more complicated. The forced distance after our kiss was torture of a kind I had not anticipated. Every accidental touch in the narrow hallway sending electricity through my skin, and every shared glance across my small living room loaded with memory of his mouth on mine and the promise he had made that felt like both protection and punishment. We moved around each other with aching awareness, orbiting like celestial bodies held in place by gravity we could not escape, and I found myself noticing details I had no business cataloging. The way his jaw tightened when he was frustrated with a phone call, or how his shoulders gradually relaxed when Lucy climbed onto the couch beside him with a book. On the fifth morning, James called, and I watched Alexander's entire demeanor shift as he listened, his body going still in that predatory way that reminded me exactly what he was capable of. And when he ended the call and looked at me, I saw grim satisfaction mixed with something darker. They had located Drummond's position, he said, and his voice was flat and controlled in a way that made my blood run cold. He was going to confront the threat directly, end this tonight, and as he moved through my apartment gathering his phone and keys and checking something at his waistband that I realized with sick certainty was a weapon, terror gripped me so completely I could barely breathe. I grabbed his arm as he headed toward the door, and the words came out desperate and raw, begging him to be careful, to come back. And I heard the fear in my voice strip away any pretense that I was not completely entangled in whatever this was between us. Alexander turned and cupped my face with both hands, and his dark eyes blazed with fierce intensity as he promised he would come back to me, that nothing and no one would keep him from returning. And then he kissed my forehead with aching tenderness that felt like a vow before walking out my door with James and two other men whose faces were hard with lethal purpose. The next 6 hours were agony stretched into eternity, every minute crawling past, while my mind conjured horrific scenarios of Alexander bleeding in some dark alley, or worse, and I held Lucy close and read her stories with a voice I fought to keep steady, while inside I was screaming. Catherine came when I called her and sat with me after Lucy finally fell asleep, holding my hand and not saying the platitudes we both knew would be hollow, just being present while I fell apart in slow motion. Finally, near midnight, I heard footsteps in the hallway, and my heart stopped, and then my door opened, and Alexander stood there unharmed, but with blood on his shirt that I knew was not his, and his eyes found mine with relief so profound it looked like pain. "Drummond has been neutralized," he said quietly, and the careful phrasing told me everything about what neutralized meant. The threat is over. You and Lucy are safe now. I should have felt overwhelming relief, should have collapsed with the weight of fear finally lifting, but instead I felt dread open like a chasm in my chest, because the danger that had kept him here was gone, and now there was no excuse to keep him close. Nothing to justify the way we had been living in each other's pockets for these intense days. And I realized with terrible clarity that losing him might hurt worse than any threat Richard Drummond had ever posed. Alexander stood in my living room near the door with his jacket already on and his phone in his hand. And when he spoke, his voice was carefully professional in a way that felt like distance being carved between us, telling me that James would maintain distant surveillance for another week as a precaution. But I and Lucy were safe now and could return to our normal lives. He prepared to leave, and the goodbye was awkward and loaded with everything unspoken, his dark eyes meeting mine for just a moment before sliding away. And I wanted to ask him to stay, but the words stuck in my throat, because what right did I have to keep him here now that the danger had passed? After he was gone, the apartment felt impossibly empty despite Lucy chattering beside me, like all the air had been sucked out and replaced with something thin and insufficient. And I moved through the evening routines in a daze, putting Lucy to bed and cleaning the kitchen and folding laundry that had been neglected during the crisis. I tried to return to normal over the following days, picking up extra shifts at the hospital and taking Lucy to the park and having coffee with Catherine. But everything felt hollow, like I was watching my own life through thick glass. And at night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, remembering the weight of Alexander's body against mine and the desperate promise he had made. Lucy asked repeatedly when Alexander was coming back, her 5-year-old mind unable to understand why someone who had become such a fixture would simply disappear, and I had no good answers for her or for myself. A week passed with no contact, and I told myself this was for the best, that Lucy and I could not be part of his dangerous world no matter what I felt, that the smart thing was to let him fade back into the life he belonged to while I stayed in mine. I threw myself into being the mother Lucy deserved, present and stable and safe, pushing down the ache that lived under my ribs like a bruise that would not heal. Then late one night, after Lucy had been asleep for hours, and I was mindlessly scrolling through my phone unable to settle, there was a knock on my door, quiet but deliberate, and my heart slammed against my ribs as I looked through the peephole to see Alexander standing in the dim hallway. He looked uncharacteristically uncertain when I opened the door, his hands shoved in his pockets and his shoulders tight with tension, and the careful control he usually wore like armor had cracks showing through. He told me he had tried to stay away, had convinced himself it was the right thing to give me space and let me choose my life without his shadow over it. But he could not do it, could not go another day without seeing me, and he wanted me in his life, but would not make me choose his world if I was not ready. I stared at him and realized with sudden clarity that I had already chosen, had chosen the moment I grabbed his arm and begged him to come back to me. Had probably chosen long before that, and whatever fear or doubt I had been nursing for the past week dissolved in the face of the raw need in his eyes. I reached out and grabbed the front of his shirt and pulled him inside my apartment, and then I was kissing him with all the longing and desperation of the past week, pouring everything I could not say into the press of my mouth against his, and his arms came around me like he was afraid I might disappear if he did not hold tight enough. We began a relationship in the careful way of two people navigating terrain that could shift beneath our feet at any moment. Alexander showing up at my apartment 3 evenings a week after Lucy's bedtime with takeout containers, and that guarded expression that gradually softened as the weeks passed. And I found myself learning the rhythms of his life the way he learned mine, the late phone calls when business kept him away, and the quiet mornings when he arrived early enough to see Lucy off to school. He was patient with her in a way that made my chest ache, sitting on my worn couch answering her endless questions about why the sky was blue and whether dragons were real with the same serious attention he probably gave to business negotiations. And I watched this dangerous man who commanded an empire get bossed around by a 5-year-old demanding he play tea party, and felt something inside me crack open. Alexander was protective in ways that could have been suffocating, but he learned to temper his instincts when I pushed back, the first time I refused his offer of a driver and insisted on taking the bus to work, resulting in a tense conversation where I had to explain that I needed to maintain my independence even if it made him uncomfortable. And to my surprise, he listened and agreed, though I noticed James trailing at a distance for the next week until Alexander finally pulled back completely. I set firm boundaries about Lucy's exposure to his business, and Alexander agreed without hesitation, keeping that part of his world carefully separate from our small apartment and the life we were building. And he never took calls about certain matters when Lucy was present, and never brought anyone from his organization around, except James, who Lucy had decided was her friend. Meeting more of his world was inevitable, and I found myself at a dinner party at his estate, surrounded by men whose names I recognized from news reports, their wives and girlfriends eyeing me with curiosity, and something that might have been respect when they realized I was not going anywhere. And I was surprised by the loyalty these people showed Alexander and the way they treated him, not with fear, but with genuine devotion. Sophia became a fixture in my life, showing up at the hospital for lunch and taking Lucy and me shopping on Saturdays, delighted to have another woman in Alexander's life and telling me stories about their childhood that helped me understand the man he had become. I saw how Alexander managed legitimate businesses alongside the illegal enterprises, real estate developments and shipping companies and investment portfolios that were slowly becoming the foundation of something cleaner. And I understood he was trying to build a way out, even if the path was long and complicated. The moral complexity of loving a man who operated outside the law kept me awake some nights, lying in my bed knowing he was across town making decisions I could not ask about. But I could not deny what I felt, or the way my heart lifted every time I heard his knock on my door, and I made peace with the contradiction the only way I could by choosing to believe in the man he was becoming, rather than only the man he had been. 3 months into our relationship, I thought we had found our rhythm, and that the worst dangers had passed, but I should have known better than to believe Alexander's world would ever truly be safe. And it started with small things I barely noticed at first, like Alexander taking more calls in the other room, and James appearing at the apartment with a tension in his shoulders that made my nursing instincts flare. Then one Tuesday evening, Alexander arrived earlier than usual, with that careful control back in place, like armor he had temporarily removed. And he told me someone from his past named Thomas Blake had begun making moves against his territory. A former associate who had been forced out years ago and apparently nursed his grievances into something toxic and dangerous. Worse, Blake had become aware of me and Lucy, asking questions and making it clear he understood exactly how to hurt Alexander most effectively. And I watched Alexander's jaw tighten as he explained this in that calm voice he used when he was actually furious. His protective instincts went into immediate overdrive, and he wanted Lucy and me moved to his estate that night, bags packed, and our life here temporarily abandoned until the threat was contained. And I felt my own defenses rise because I had just begun to feel stable again, and Lucy was thriving in her school and her routine. I refused to uproot her life, and Alexander's expression shifted into something harder, insisting this was not negotiable because Blake was unpredictable and vicious in ways Drummond had never been. And suddenly we were having our first serious fight with his fear manifesting as demands, and my need for autonomy pushing back against his attempts to control the situation. I accused him of seeing me as something to be protected and locked away, rather than as a partner who deserved input into decisions affecting my daughter. And the words came out sharper than I intended, but they needed to be said. And Alexander went very still in that way that usually preceded calculated violence, but instead he seemed to be turning my accusation over in his mind. He was quiet for a long moment, and then admitted I was right, his voice rough with something that might have been shame. telling me his first instinct was always to eliminate threats by any means necessary, and that included removing me and Lucy from any possible danger, even if it meant disregarding what I wanted. He apologized, and I could see the effort it took for him to push past his protective fury and actually hear me, and we compromised on enhanced security without disrupting Lucy's routine, additional men watching the school and the apartment building, and James doing more frequent check-ins. I appreciated his growth and told him so, reaching for his hand across my small kitchen table, and that night after Lucy was asleep, Alexander revealed more of his traumatic past than he ever had before. How he had watched his parents murdered when he was 19 and Sophia only 9, how he had built his empire through violence and calculation because it was the only way to protect her in a world that had proven itself savage and unforgiving. He told me meeting me had made him want to be better, to find a way out of the darkness he had lived in for so long, and I pulled him close and kissed him with all the tenderness I possessed, because I understood finally that his controlling instincts came from a place of deep trauma, and that loving him meant helping him learn a different way. The call came at 2:47 p.m. while I was in the middle of changing wound dressings on a patient in the ICU, my phone vibrating in my pocket with that specific pattern I had assigned to Lucy's school, and the moment I saw the number my stomach dropped because they never called unless something was wrong. I excused myself and stepped into the hallway with hands that had gone cold, answering to hear Principal Morrison's carefully controlled voice telling me there had been an incident in the pickup line. Men in a vehicle had attempted to approach Lucy, but Alexander's security detail had intervened, and Lucy was safe in the office, and could I please come immediately? I was in my car within 3 minutes, breaking every speed limit, my mind caught between relief that she was unharmed, and a fury so intense it felt like fire in my veins. And when I burst into the school office, Lucy ran to me crying, and I held her so tight I was probably hurting her, but I could not make myself let go. James was there looking grim, and explained quietly that 2 of Blake's men had tried to grab Lucy during the afternoon pickup chaos. But the security team Alexander had insisted on posting despite my objections had stopped them, and the men were now in Alexander's custody, and I felt sick knowing what that meant, but also savagely glad. I took Lucy home with James following in his vehicle and more security setting up positions around my building, and by the time Alexander arrived an hour later, I had moved past fear into a cold determination that surprised me with its intensity. He started to apologize and explain, but I cut him off, demanding to be part of the solution rather than hidden away like some helpless damsel, and I could see him trying to shift into protective mode and shut me down, but I refused to let him. I told him I had proven my resourcefulness the day I saved Sophia, that I was a nurse who stayed calm in crisis situations, and that I would not sit passively while Blake continued to threaten my daughter, and Alexander looked at me with something between frustration and admiration. I proposed using myself as bait to draw Blake out with Alexander's team ready to intervene, a controlled scenario where we dictated the terms, and Alexander immediately started listing reasons why that was unacceptable, but I could see him running calculations behind his eyes. He hated the plan but recognized my determination, and after an hour of planning with James, we had a strategy. Eleanor meeting Blake in a public coffee shop the next afternoon, wearing a wire with a full security team in position and sharpshooters on surrounding rooftops. The next day I dressed carefully in jeans and a sweater, trying to look unthreatening while my heart hammered against my ribs. And Alexander gripped my shoulders before I left and made me promise to run at the first sign of trouble, his dark eyes fierce with protective fury and something deeper. Blake arrived exactly on time, a lean man in his 40s with cold eyes and a smile that made my skin crawl. And he sat across from me ordering coffee like this was a normal meeting, while I forced myself to stay calm and ask him what he wanted. He told me he wanted to destroy everything Alexander loved as revenge for past betrayals, for being forced out of the organization he helped build, and his voice carried such venom I understood this man would never stop until one of them was dead, and I tried to keep him talking while Alexander's team closed in. Then Blake's expression shifted, and he reached into his jacket, and suddenly there was a gun emerging, and instinct took over. Everything I had learned in the self-defense classes I took after Lucy's father left, and I grabbed his wrist and twisted hard, using his momentum against him. The weapon clattered to the floor, and suddenly James was there with 3 other men subduing Blake while I stumbled backward with adrenaline making my hands shake, and then Alexander was in front of me checking me for injuries with hands that trembled slightly, his relief and pride evident in equal measure. In the aftermath, Blake was taken away by Alexander's men, and I did not ask what would happen to him, because some things were better left unknown. And we returned to my apartment where Lucy was staying with Catherine, who took one look at my face and pulled me into a hug, while Alexander stood nearby looking like he wanted to do the same, but was holding himself back. After Catherine left, and Lucy was finally asleep after demanding 3 stories and reassurance that the bad man was gone, Alexander and I sat on my worn couch in the dim light of my living room, and he turned to me with an intensity that made my breath catch. He told me he could not live in fear of losing me, that the terror of those moments when Blake had pulled his weapon had clarified everything, and he wanted Lucy and me permanently in his life, under his protection as his family. He was not quite proposing, but the intention was clear in every word, and in the way his hand gripped mine like I might disappear, and my heart hammered against my ribs, because this was the moment where I had to decide what kind of life I wanted. I admitted I loved him, and the words felt like jumping off a cliff. But I needed time to consider what this life truly meant for Lucy long term, whether I could raise my daughter in the shadow of his world even as he worked to legitimize it. Alexander went very still, and I saw the flash of fear in his eyes that I might ultimately choose differently. But then he nodded and told me he would wait as long as I needed because I was worth waiting for. His growth in that moment, his willingness to give me space and choice instead of demanding or controlling, made me love him even more. Over the following weeks, I watched him with Lucy during the dinners. He joined us for 3 or 4 times each week, saw how he listened to her stories about kindergarten with genuine interest, and helped her build elaborate block towers with infinite patience. I watched him navigate his organization's business, both legal and otherwise, saw the empire he was slowly and carefully legitimizing through real estate investments and security consulting firms. I met with Sophia for coffee, and she told me she had never seen her brother so happy, that Eleanor had given him something to build toward, instead of just protect. I lay awake at night weighing the dangers against the security he offered, the moral complexity against the undeniable love I felt, and gradually I recognized that love meant accepting all of someone, including their past and their scars. Lucy was happier and more secure with Alexander in our lives, lighting up whenever he arrived and asking constantly when we would see him next. And I realized she had already chosen him as surely as my heart had. On a quiet Thursday evening after I had put Lucy to bed, Alexander arrived for what he thought was just dinner, and I told him I was ready. I chose him, chose us, chose this complicated, dangerous, beautiful life we would build together. Alexander pulled me close with hands that trembled slightly and promised to spend every day earning that choice, to protect us and love us and work toward the legitimate future he had started building. We kissed with all the pent-up longing and relief and promise of everything ahead, and I could hear Lucy's soft breathing from her room where she slept safely nearby, protected by a man who would burn the world down to keep us safe, and I knew with absolute certainty that I had finally found home.